Welcome back. It's good to see you all again. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about a very interesting study that was done in the US and Canada by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. And this study was aimed at understanding, as many studies that this organization does, how much renewable energy can be integrated into our North American grid. And so the idea of the study is to interconnect the eastern and western parts of the United States in a single model, okay? So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the interconnection seam study that I just mentioned. Another thing that I will be telling you about is a PLEXOS feature that's up and coming called Geographic Decomposition. And then I'll tell you a little bit about another study that NREL is doing called the North American Renewable Integration Study. And then I'll show you some pictures that are nice and also allow you to visualize PLEXOS outputs in a way that are pretty cool. So I'll show you those things. So as I mentioned, the interconnection seam study is joining the United States and Canada in a single grid. These are two very large systems, and the grid that we're talking about is not simply a zonal one, but a nodal one, because most of these markets are nodal. So it's modeling every single bus in that area. So the organizations that was running this study was called the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They're in Golden, Colorado, and they're a national lab in the United States. So they're funded by our Department of Energy. And PLEXOS has been in use at NREL since 2012. And they use PLEXOS on their Peregrine high-performance computing cluster. This is a very exciting and very big machine, and they run a lot of PLEXOS simulations. The interconnections seam study, if you want to learn more about it, I provided a link up at the top so that you can understand a little bit more about the study and maybe get some more documents about it if you like. But the overall purpose of it is that in the United States there are 3 interconnections, and I'll show you a map in just a minute, but there's the Western Interconnection, the Eastern Interconnection, and the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, called ERCOT. And at present, very little electricity is transferred between these 3 large grids. And what the study was meaning to undertake was how much value there is in interconnecting those more completely. So allowing for more interconnection between these grids. So here's the map. Oops. So there's the Western Interconnection, the Eastern Interconnection, and there's ERCOT. And of course, parts of Canada are also in the Western and Eastern Interconnect. And so the model that I'm going to be telling you about in a minute joins the Western and the Eastern part together. It leaves out ERCOT, but there's plans to include that in a future model. Here are the main members of the research team for this project. And so it was quite a wide collaboration. Included on that collaboration were 2 market operators in the United States, the Southwest Power Pool and the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and also the government organization, the Western Area Power Administration, and then 4 national labs and 1 university. And there was also a technical review committee that I was a part of, and it involved representatives from 30+ utilities, And 6 of the 10 system operators in the US and Canada, and then also a number of industry organizations, but Energy Exemplar was key amongst those because of the use of PLEXOS in the study. All right, so here's a nice picture of basically what the problem is. So let me talk you through this a little bit. Here is the United States as it presently exists, and you'll notice that we have red bubbles that indicate the population centers where most of the load is. We've got blue bubbles that indicate hydroelectric resources. We have these kind of purplish shaded regions here, and those shaded regions are representing fossil fuel resources like coal or natural gas. And then we see over here in this area, this blue shaded area is wind resources. And then we also see that solar resources are shaded yellow. And then there's also quite a lot of overlap between the two here. So the problem that we're trying to solve is, what if this boundary was less of a boundary and more of just an interconnection, just another interconnection, another opportunity for interchange between the various parts of the United States. It looks, just based on this map, like there's incredible potential for sharing energy between the eastern and western United States. So you can see here that most of the high quality wind resources in the United States are sort of in the middle of the country. That means that at some periods in the day, the power should go this direction. And in other periods of the day, it should go this direction. But right now, it can't really do that very easily because of that boundary in the middle. Likewise, the solar resources are distributed across the whole country. But the sun, of course, only shines at certain times of day. So here, the solar resources that are here should be going this way in the morning, and the solar resources that are here should be going this way in the evening. And if this seam here is strengthened to allow for more interconnection, to allow for more interchange, then more solar energy can move in the correct direction at the correct time of day. And the United States would be able to have more like a 12 or 14-hour solar day instead of locationally having about a 10 or a 12-hour solar day in the winter. So even in the winter, it would be able to do that. And in the summer, it would have quite a lot more capability. Wrong direction. Okay, so this is a picture. So in the course of this study, what they came up with was a number of different designs for how to strengthen the interconnection. So in this picture, what we're looking at is the seam here. This seam here, as it presently exists, has a number of HVDC back-to-back ties. There's 7 of them that go along here. And the idea here in this example is to simply strengthen these DC interties and then do enough AC strengthening so that we can get all the power that needs to go there to this seam in the middle. Here is another option. Instead of strengthening the back-to-backs, actually eliminate most of them, but replace them with very long DC interties. And the question was, first of all, which of these is more efficient from an engineering point of view, but also which of these is more efficient economically. There was a third model that I'm not going to talk about because I don't have quite enough time. We'll see some numbers about it, but we'll focus on these 2 designs. This is the overall study process for this simulation exercise. And here, this is the main area where PLEXOS was in use, was to run production cost models for this very large model. Okay, so They developed many years ago, they began developing Eastern and Western and Eastern grid studies so that they could study renewable integration in the West and the East. LCGS stands for Low Carbon Grid Study, and ERGIS is Eastern Renewable Grid Integration Study. Okay? And so then what they did is they updated that data, and then once they updated that data, this piece here was a capacity expansion plan, because this is being done in a forecast year of 2038. So in the future year of 2038, they wanted to build out enough generation to serve that future year. And then the primary thing that PLEXOS was used for was in this piece here. And then the last piece of it was once they completed the PLEXOS model, they took the results of those studies and verified them with an AC power flow model. That was the work done by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. These pieces here were mostly done at NREL, as were these pieces. So this slide is not a slide that I invented, it's a slide that NREL invented. And their question was, why PLEXOS? And the reason that they came up with was because of the unprecedented resolution that it could bring to this kind of modeling activity. And you'll see what I mean in just a minute. But the idea here is we're modeling at a very, very fine and detailed level the entire United States and most of Canada. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a model that is a mixed integer programming model with 98,000 nodes, more than 100,000 lines. It's running a DC OPF, so it's running the full DC power flow, has around 12,000 generators. It's the first model to simulate at this level of granularity the entirety of the United States and Canada together. So what kind of results did we get out of this model? So although this says current policy and carbon policy, current policy means continuing the current policies we have about renewable integration or renewable generation into the future, whereas the carbon policy is a low carbon future policy. So in the current policy, you can see that we had in the 2A case, we had a significant shift from fossil resources to renewable resources. So these are all the differences in generation. So here, these parts that are below zero are things that were reduced. And then the pieces that are above zero are the pieces that were increased. So you can see that we have an increase in wind and in gas CCGTs. Now, you also see a corresponding reduction in curtailment of renewable resources and also in curtailment of coal, or reduction of coal and reduction of gas, of CTs, of gas turbines, and then also a slight reduction in photovoltaic output in terms of the amount of generation. So this is a very wind-friendly model. And then you'll see here in this second case that the amount of the ability of this to increase the amount of renewable energy is actually greater than in the previous model, and there's a greater reduction, especially in coal and in, I must be reading this wrong, I don't think that that's PV. Maybe the color chart is wrong, but so you can see that there are increases in, a lot of increases in renewable generation there. And then there was a third grid that that I'm not going to talk about, but in that situation there was even more increase in renewable generation. But this was by far the most expensive of the three options. So then there's also the carbon policy, which increases the renewable generation portfolio standard throughout the United States to 30% by 2038. That's aggressive by comparison to what we presently expect. But you can see that when we do that, we have even larger amounts of renewable resources. Also, the scale of this goes up to 80 terawatt hours instead of 60. So it's even magnified a little bit more, and even deeper reductions in carbon producing generation. So this is I think the exciting part is the money. These are for a single year, and they're in billions of dollars. So you can see that the increase in the back-to-back HVDC approach yields around $800 million a year in benefit, and that's including the cost of the enhancement. And in this model here, we see an improvement of $1.1 billion, and that's including the cost of the enhancement. And in this case here, we see an increase of an improvement of $2.5 billion, including the cost of the enhancement. But that's assuming that we maintain current policy. If you look at the carbon policy, which is what many people would hope that we would embrace, you see that actually this one is less favorable than the other two. Okay, but under a carbon policy regime, the savings are even larger. So that's my conclusion on the interconnection seam study. I wanted to tell you about a couple other things that came up as part of the study as we went through the process. And one of them is the idea of geographic decomposition. At present, this doesn't exist in PLEXOS, but this is an active development. So the idea of geographic decomposition, this is a very busy picture, but I want to explain what's going on here. The idea is that you can think of the entire United States as being divided up into a number of different regions. And so this would be like the Pacific Northwest, this would be like the South, this would be like Florida, PJM, MISO, SPP, ERCOT, and so on and so forth. And the idea here is that each of those individual parts of the grid operates more or less independently. But in PLEXOS, as you know, if you build a big model like this, it optimizes all of the unit commitment at one time. And the idea that we have is that, first of all, while that's a good thing, on the other hand, it probably over-optimizes the relationship between adjacent markets. Does that make sense? So in this idea, what we do, first of all, is we look at how much power will flow between adjacent markets, but then we look to see, instead of doing unit commitment, assuming that these things are connected and well coordinated, we do the unit commitment independently for each of these various areas. So this area here would have its own unit commitment, this area here would have its own unit commitment problem, and so on and so forth. So what are the benefits of this approach? Well, first, how does it work? So MT schedule is going to estimate the interchange between regions. That's in this picture over here. All those little arrows are interchange between regions. So we run an MT schedule simulation to estimate that. And then ST schedule splits up the unit commitment with smaller regional problems that are proceeding in parallel. In the case of the interconnection seam study, NREL built their own sort of geographic decomposition feature, and this is more or less going to be incorporated into PLEXOS. But when they built their geographic decomposition feature, they found that it speeded up the overall run for this large footprint by a factor of 50. So not insignificant. It does that mostly by reducing the problem size. So these much smaller unit commitment problems are much faster. And then we're also able to meet the regional generation quotas. And the purpose of this is to simulate actual market friction, which is the partial coordination between markets. And as I mentioned, the NREL folks built this outside of PLEXOS with their own skills, but this is presently a development feature in PLEXOS, and I believe it'll be beneficial for many interregional planning studies, especially as the United States and Canada and Mexico and Central America and Latin America start to coordinate more on electric power projects. I think that we'll see a lot of runtime benefit, but also a better simulation of the friction between adjacent regions. I also wanted to tell you a little bit about the North American Renewable Integration Study. The North American Renewable Integration Study takes the idea of the interconnection seam study or other kinds of renewable integration studies that have been done in the past and applies it instead of to just the United States and Canada. It includes Texas and Mexico as well. So this is a study that's going on right now. And this study, as I mentioned, it's a single PLEXOS model with all of these regions in it. And it's a coordination between the Natural Resources Council of Canada, the SENER, the Secretariat of Energy in Mexico, and the Department of Energy in the United States. And I've included a link here if you want to learn more about this. This study is still ongoing, so there isn't a lot of results from it yet, but this is something that I think could be interesting for people to learn more about. The goal of the NREL study is specifically to understand how we can modernize North America's power system, and especially to understand how wind, solar, hydropower, and natural gas can continue to grow as we modernize our collective grid. This one is a really exciting collaboration between essentially 3 governments, and quite a lot of diplomacy has been done as well as science. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is the Kaleidoscope NREL visualization package. This is just cool to look at. And the nice thing about it is that if you wanted to take what they've done, they've made their project open source. But this is the kind of visualization that it produces. So these little wheels here show you interchange from one region to another. So here I can see that between California and the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of energy flowing. And the kind of energy that's flowing is hydropower, because it's blue, and it goes from Pacific Northwest to California. Over here, I can see that we've got from Wyoming and Colorado, we've got power flowing to the Pacific Northwest, and that particular kind of power is gas combined cycle. So you can see that this little wheel here is providing an awful lot of information in a very small package. And then this is for the eastern part of the US. And then here we have the United States and Canada, and the various bubbles are showing how much load there is, and also how much generation is coming from which sources. So the red bubbles are nuclear power. The blue is wind, and the kind of pale blue is hydro. So you can see lots of little hydro dots around here. The thing about this that's really interesting is that this is a snapshot of the United States as a whole, but it spans 4 time zones. So at various times of day, you'll actually see different amounts of renewable generation flowing one direction or another across the grid. You'll also see different amounts of load popping up. There's a really nice video that I don't have access to, but it shows how you can see the solar energy starting generation on the East Coast at the beginning of the day, and then moving across the country as the sun rises. That's a pretty neat one. So you can do all kinds of things like that with this system. And it's open source, and it's maintained by NREL. You can actually download all of the code for this project and customize it to your own uses. So I wanted to tell you about that because it's exciting to be able to take something that's very a useful visualization and then transform it for your own use. Any questions?
I'll just shout it out. Can you just flesh out in more detail how a carbon policy leads to lower costs?
So a carbon policy doesn't lead to lower costs. Those costs are higher. It's just that if you assume that there's a carbon policy and you assume that you're going to implement it, the interconnection is going to provide better benefit. So with the assumption that you are in fact implementing a 30% renewable generation standard, uniting the grids is an even better bet. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Oh. Go ahead.
Gracias. ¿Qué perspectiva prevén ante la nueva política del presidente Trump de dar un nuevo impulso al uso del carbón? ¿Y qué impactos podría tener en el proyecto de la interconexión de las 3 regiones de Estados Unidos que presentaste y con Canadá?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the translation. Can you repeat it?
President Trump's impact on U.S. policy for how's that changing things?
That's a very good question. I feel unqualified to say too much about that. But I can tell you that there have been some changes at the National Renewable Energy Lab. There have been, of course, there has been actually for this North American Renewable Integration Study that has required quite a lot of diplomacy. This project has slowed down a bit in recent months. But I think that that's a thing that could happen when any presidential election happens. The Mexican presidential election also caused a little bit of a slowdown in this process. So as governments change, these kinds of big government-funded studies do encounter some friction of their own. I think that people expected that. On the other hand, yeah, apart from that, I'm not really able to say too much. I'm sorry.
Dentro del estudio, ahorita, cuando se hace la planeación con carbón, ¿se están considerando todos aquellos efectos negativos, digamos, las externalidades negativas que implica una expansión a base de generación carboeléctrica en cuanto a impactos a la salud, en cuanto a la cuestión de los bonos de carbón? ¿Se considera dentro de esta expansión o se asume que no hay tales impactos y solamente se considera el costo de inversión de la central?
That's a great question. And so there isn't a whole lot of consensus around how to consider the health impacts of carbon. In many parts of the world, health impacts of carbon are being taxed through carbon taxes or through carbon emission restrictions. The study doesn't specifically address carbon except as sort of a byproduct of renewable generation, or carbon reductions as a byproduct of renewable generation increases. So the study does not specifically implement, except where those policies already exist. So in particular, in the state of California, there's what's called a hurdle rate. And this hurdle rate expresses a cost to importing generation from outside areas by virtue of the carbon that comes with that. So that policy was implemented, but that's a very indirect way of modeling that carbon impact. That's the largest sense in which that's true.
Well, I have a question regarding to the model. You say that you face the challenge of this problem, maybe in some geographic decomposition to solve the simulation.
Yes.
But that was considered to analyze the impact in the simulation. What you could think that could be necessary decomposition? For example, if we want to study investment optimization in this, because I think that it should be a huge problem in USA.
Correct.
So what do you think, or what should be your recommendation about some kind of decomposition for that?
Correct. So your point is very well taken. The primary benefit of geographic decomposition is that it provides a great performance boost, and it also simulates existing market friction. However, it's very difficult to calibrate. More importantly, while we know that there is already market friction between the seams, there are many sorts of operational ways of addressing those at present that are hard to represent. So if one was looking to build a resource or invest in a resource that was near one of these boundaries between markets, one would probably feel compelled not to make geographic decomposition at that boundary exactly. Which is one of the reasons that actually the proposal for the PLEXOS development feature is not for it to be tightly bound to the existing NERC reliability zones, but instead to have it be user customizable, in which case users can select groups of nodes to have as part of a geographic decomposition area so that they can study large scale performance, but also maintain most of the important local area effects in more detail. This is something that will develop over time, I'm sure. I don't think that there's any great understanding or consensus about exactly how the best way to do this is at the present, so there's going to be some learning that happens there. But I think over time, we will find that it provides a lot of useful benefit. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.